This is the Venturing Angler Podcast. I'm Tim Harden. In this episode, we're chatting with Ryan Johnston about a variety of topics, including his new book, his guiding, and his work with Cast Hope. Let's chat with Ryan. All right, we're here with Ryan Johnston, author and founder of Cast Hope. Welcome to the Venturing Angler Podcast.
Thanks, Tim. Super stoked to be here, man.
So, I really don't know where to start. Cast Hope is something I definitely want to spend some time on, as well as your new book about guiding. But for those who don't know you, what's your general background?
Yeah, I was born and raised in San Diego. I was raised by a father who loved conventional fishing. So like a lot of us, I started with red and white bobbers off a dock and graduated to some offshore fishing in San Diego when I was in junior high school with my father. And once I graduated high school, I came north, went to UC Davis for college, and I thought I made a good decision by not going to the University of Montana. Got accepted there, but I was scared I was going to fly fish and not get a degree, so opted off of that and went to Davis. And long would I know that I actually went to a place where I could fish year-round. Rather than just having a seasonal fishery in Missoula. And I would end up working at a fly shop my freshman year of college and kind of fell in love with the industry and became a fly fishing guide when I was a junior at UC Davis. And I've been a guide in Northern California for the last 20 years. I've done a couple stints in Idaho. I've spent 5 summers guiding on the South Fork of the Snake in that window as well. And halfway through that, about 13 years ago, I ended up deciding I needed to give back to my community. And so I started a fly fishing nonprofit for kids called Cast Hope. And I now help oversee that organization. And we serve all kinds of kids all over California. And so fly fishing has been a huge part of my life for the last 20 years. That's how I've made my living, provided for my family, and most of my friends are now from the industry.
So you moved on from red and white bobbers to eventually strike indicators.
Pretty much the same thing. Yeah, it's just it's a fancier way to do it. Rather than baiting your worm on your hook and waiting for a bass or a bluegill to take the bobber down, now I'm just tying 3 fancy flies that a trout steelhead will take at the bobber under. So I am definitely under the thought process that it is a bobber. It is not an indicator. So I guess I have not grown up. I guess I'm still the same as when I was 3 years old.
No, I am when you see those memes where it's someone like saying strike indicator instead of bobber, and they're like, it's the picture of the person looking down at the peasants, and it's like,
yes,
that's me.
Yes.
Like I'm the one who still says strike indicator and thinks it's something.
I am a fan of the bobber. I know there's a lot of, different opinions on indicator fishing. But man, it is deadly. It catches a ton of fish. It's not the most entertaining way to fish, but if you're into bending rods and catching as many possible, there's no doubt that the bobber, indicator, jadicator, whatever word you want to use, it's deadly.
I personally love it. So it's funny, California's got a lot of great fly fishing. It always seems like Southern California, especially San Diego, is pretty far from fly fishing. And there's a new scene down there, which is pretty exciting to see, just a little offshore. But was it your experience in Davis that really fed the passion? What really got you more into fly fishing?
Yeah, the Southern California stuff is awesome. As technology has increased over the last 25 years, the offshore stuff down there has become really possible. Um, you know, I, I I really, my passion for fishing actually would start in Wyoming. My grandfather would buy a ranch about an hour southwest of Jackson Hole. That we would end up spending every summer there, all the way from the time I was 12 till I graduated high school, and then I kept going there every summer even after high school. So my actual first fly fishing experience was on the South Fork of the Snake River when I was 12. Um, Never done it before. My dad had seen the famous river, famous movie, A River Runs Through It. Some people call it A River Ruined It, whatever your opinion on is on that. But so we saw Brad Pitt all sexied up catching a 10-pound brown trout. And my dad like, wow, that looks cool. So for my 12th birthday, he's like, Ryan, how about we go on a fly fishing trip? And so I loved fishing. Again, it was all conventional stuff. And so I said, yeah, let's try it. So on my 12th birthday, we'd float the South Fork of the Snake with a guide, and he would teach us how to cast. And something about casting a big dry fly at the bank and watching cutthroat rise off the bank, and the visual part of that, of seeing the fish come up. And cutthroat are never in an urgency to eat your fly, so you get to see that fish for 4 or 5 seconds. And after that day, man, I was hooked. Like, there was something that was really magical about it. The next day, we'd go into our little local fly shop in Thane, Wyoming, which was more of a hunting store than it was a fly shop. And my dad bought me a Fenwick rod, and we bought a handful of flies. Because we'd only fish dry flies with the guide, that's pretty much what we thought it was. So every summer I would go out to my grandfather's ranch, and I would teach myself how to dry fly fish, primarily on a river called the Salt. Salt River was a great fishery, full of 10 to 18-inch cutthroat. And I never knew what a bobber was. So something about those cutthroats, man, they captured my interest, and that would then flow into, well, what else can we fly fish for? And at that time, fly fishing in San Diego Bay was becoming a thing. So there was a guide, Peter Piccone, who was dialing all that out. And so Peter, when I was 14, taught me how to cast my first shooting head. So we'd go into San Diego Bay and fish for calico bass, bay bass, halibut, pretty much whatever would eat your fly. And so Peter taught me how to cast a shooting head through high school. And then that would lead to, fishing off the beach in San Diego, and then eventually taking, fly rods offshore. So but everything started, man, from the age of 12, watching that cutthroat on the South Fork of the Snake rise to a dry fly.
That's cool. That beach fishing on the Pacific is hard. Um, that's some skill development, I'm sure.
Yeah, doing the beach surf zone is challenging. Again, Peter Piccone kind of taught me how to do it, and look for those riptide zones and look for those pockets. And I had a lot of great days. I would fish way south in San Diego. I would fish in Imperial Beach. It was literally looking at TJ from where I was fishing. And the mouth of the Tijuana River, it's literally the border of the United States and Mexico, was a zone that nobody fished and was absolutely loaded. So you could go there, catch perch, halibut, leopard sharks, Corbina, I mean, there was all kinds of stuff down there, man. You just tie on a small tan and brown clouser and a little small shooting head, and figure out how to time the waves, and it was a killer time. I mean, so much of my high school age years, I was down on those beaches just chasing whatever would eat a fly.
And for those who aren't familiar with SoCal jargon, TJ is Tijuana.
Yes, TJ is a place that many people go. Some people disappear, but it is a famous place if you grew up in San Diego.
It is. Yeah, people go down there for anything. Last time I was there, I ate some hella good tacos. I was leading a group of college students on an immersion trip, and I told them we're gonna go to a taco stand, and they're like, no, we want to go to a nice restaurant, and I was like, that's ridiculous. We're here to like, do service. We're not going out to a nice restaurant. I'm gonna teach you guys moderation, and so I took them to a taco stand, and I ate like 2 tacos, and then 4, and then 6, and then 7, like so like my lesson about like living simply like was a disaster because it was the best tacos I'd ever had.
Oh my gosh, the Mexican food in Southern California. The rest of you in the nation can say you have good Mexican food, but until you live in Southern California, you have no idea what you're talking about.
Yeah, I concur. Did your interest in going to the University of California, Davis, have anything to do with fishing?
It did not. It's surprisingly my knowledge of Northern California at the time. This was kind of, I mean, you got to kind of go back with technology. The internet was really just becoming a thing kind of in my later high school years, right? So late 90s, 2000, so it wasn't like all this information was available for fishing. So like I have a lot of memories in high school of reading these, how to fish California books, how to fish Colorado guidebooks, so we're still on that paper book thing. And so my knowledge of California was like Hat Creek, Fall River, and the McCloud, and I knew that was all in Northern California, but I knew it wasn't close to Davis. So when I moved to Davis, it was more of an educational decision than it was a fishing decision. And I was heading to San Francisco with some friends, and there's a little town between Davis and San Francisco called Vacaville. And I was driving through Vacaville, and I saw a fly fishing sign, and I was like, wow, there's a fly shop in Vacaville? I had no clue. It literally was 20 minutes away from where I was going to college. And so we went and partied in San Francisco for the day, came home, and the next day I went into this fly shop and talked to the owner. The owner's name was Toby Uppinghouse. Toby's still a successful guide in Northern California, and went in and started talking to Toby, and I was like, well, where do you guys fish locally? And he just started telling me about all these rivers that were literally within 30 minutes to an hour and a half from Davis, and I had no clue.
That's cool.
And my decision of not going to Missoula was completely based on I was scared that I wasn't going to get a degree. I was like, the Bitter River is the edge of the campus, so I'm going to go there. I'm just going to fish and like hang out with girls, and the odds of me getting a degree here are probably not high, and I was like, so the safer bet is I should go to Davis because that's a good education. It's a good school to go to. But I had no clue that I was moving to a place where I had endless fishing opportunities, surrounding the college, and moving to a place where there was no off season, right? Like the nice thing about Northern California is there's literally, you can fish 12 months a year. So
right. Yep.
My freshman year at Davis, I would end up fishing 90 days
Oh my
on my
God.
own. So I'm not sure I made the wise decision between that and Missoula. I probably would have fished less than that in Montana, but that would ultimately lead me to get a job at the fly shop, at Toby's fly shop, and Toby would offer me a job a year later, and that would ultimately pave the way for me guiding in Northern California for 20 years.
That's great. I actually used to keep, when I was living in California, I used to keep my drift boat in Vacaville. And
Okay.
there's no practical reason, it would seem, to keep a drift boat in Vacaville because there's it's just farmland, right? Like and some strip malls, and that's about it. But for me, I would always have to drive from the peninsula through San Francisco, then into Oakland, Berkeley area, all that traffic. And so if I kept, and then once I got to Vacaville, that's where it splits to either go up north to like, the Trinity River in the lower Sac, or that's where you go west or east to, Montana or Colorado or whatever. And so keeping the drift boat right there at that like split saved me from traffic with a drift boat, driving through San Francisco with a drift boat. I think it was the smartest decision I ever made.
Vacaville's a great town. It's so funny how the perception of California on a national level is that, we're this, this state of San Francisco and LA, and we're beaches, and then our fly fishing is like really average. I can argue I have fly fished all over the West, and if you're talking trout fishing, California rivals any state you will go to. Just the difference is, like, when you go to Montana or Idaho or Wyoming, like, odds are you're gonna get to throw dry flies, right? And the majority of our fishing in California is all under a bobber. And there are some opportunities to throw dries here and there, but it's really rare. It's not consistent. And if we had fisheries where we had huge stonefly hatches, or we had these green drake hatches, like some of these bigger hatches you have in the West, and we had fish that would rise on a daily basis, on a consistent basis, people would flood to California to fish, from all over the world. But because we are a bobber indicator, based state, primarily, what we have is we have primarily local fishing. Most of the anglers that fish with us come from, two major metropolitan areas, whether, the San Francisco Bay Area or Sacramento, but our fishing is as good as any fishing you'll find in Montana, any fishing you'll find in Idaho or Wyoming. It's just, you have to be okay with fishing a bobber for them.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
it's a sad fact.
And there's some spots here and there, a couple little ranches and some high country spots where you could fish dries. Not as easily as, like, I mean, right now I could drive 5 minutes and maybe catch some trout on midges, like
Right.
right now, um,
Yeah.
in the
I mean,
snow.
there are places in Northern California that have dry fly fishing. It doesn't compare to any of the Rockies, and because of that, California is not a destination fishery. It should be, but it's not.
Yeah, it's the kind of place where you could go steelheading and think, like, this is some of the best steelheading in the world. It's not BC, but it's outstanding. Or, you could go trout fishing and it's world class, but it's not like, it's not the Madison. Um, but you could also, in the same day, decide to cut over to the Yuba and catch, like, shad and stripers or trout. Like, there's just so much you can do, and that's pretty special.
Yeah, I actually have. There's a section of the Lower Sacramento River. It's actually my favorite drift. Not a lot of guides fish it, but it's a part of the river where the river starts warming up. So we're south of Red Bluff, and if you go down there, there's about a 15-mile stretch where you have all these fish start cohabitating together. So you can literally fish for trout and steelhead in the riffles and drop-offs. You can then, when you get to the slow water, you can switch your rods, switch to 8 weights, 9 weights with shooting heads, and start fishing for stripers, literally 200 feet where you just caught a rainbow or a steelhead. And then you can pull into these creek mouths. There's like 4 or 5 creek mouths on this certain section of the river that are loaded with smallmouth and largemouth. So it was always a fun thing. I would take, a handful of clients down there, guys who were really familiar with, like, okay, here I'm handing you an indicator rod. Now I'm handing you a shooting head. Now I'm handing you a floating frog. Like, you have to have a client who's well versified in fishing techniques. And you could go down there, and my record was six species in one day. We had a day where we caught a trout, steelhead, striper, smallmouth, largemouth, and then we ended up randomly catching a salmon on a striper fly, all within 15 miles on the exact same drift. So, like, there's very few places in the world where you can do that.
Yeah.
Where you can catch a trout and steelhead and literally in a riffle go 200 feet, 50 yards, and then switch rods and catch a 10-pound striper. Like, I
I
mean, California's special, man.
It is. And I did John Sherman's Delta Days once. And is that what it's called? Yeah.
Yes. Yep. Yep.
Um, and the guy I was with, he was he was like a pro bass guy, I think, fishing with a conventional rod, and I was making the best of the situation.
Yeah.
but he caught. I think he only caught 3 fish, but it was a king salmon, a striped bass, and I think a smallmouth. Is that possible?
Yeah, it's possible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it was like, this is ridiculous. Um,
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
in a morning of
It,
fishing. Um,
yeah.
yeah, yeah, and then like I go to Argentina a bit. I'm catching trout from the McLeod there. So
Right.
there's
Yeah.
just so much that comes that's in California and comes out of California. I was gonna say that Hogan Brown was on the podcast a year ago talking about some of those lower sack stripe bass, um, and it like freaked me out. Like I had no idea that there were these monster residentials just you know lurking in that water.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, yeah, I've been really fortunate to be good friends with Hogan, and Hogan has shared a bunch of his knowledge with me about the striper game on the Sacramento River. So I think he's been guiding it for 10 years. I've been guiding it for 8. Um, and man, it is. I mean, it is truly a place of hunting. Like if you're looking for a lifetime striper, like I mean, there's East Coast obviously has a lot of monster fish, but in California, the Sacramento River and the Feather River have more big stripers than anywhere in the Delta or the San Francisco Bay. There's a lot of smaller fish that get in your way and kind of keep you entertained. But that drift I was talking about earlier, where below Red Bluff, where you have all these fish cohabitating together, 6 different times now I've had guys where they've had 16 18-inch rainbows on their line, and a 30 to 50 pound striper will come up and literally just swallow the fish right next to the boat, and rip your fish off your line, and you're trying to tell the guy, like, feed him line, give him line, let him eat it, like you're hoping that you can transfer over to that bigger striper. Rarely do people listen to you, but I last fall I was on that specific section, and we had maybe a 9 or 10 pound really beautiful bright steelhead that we had been fighting for a while. And then all of a sudden the steelhead just started like shooting up in the shallow water, kind of not normal, fish behavior. Like, man, that's weird. That fish shouldn't be going that direction, And then all of a sudden there's this huge V that pops up in the shallows, and there's like a 50-pound striper that's chasing this 9 to 10 pound steelhead. And the striper chases the steelhead so shallow to the point where the steelhead practically beaches itself, and the steelhead can no longer swim. So it's sitting on its side and it's technically breathing water, but like the steelhead is now stuck, and the striper is about 2.5 feet away, just staring at the fish, trying to wiggle hard as it can. I mean, it literally looked like a killer whale playing with a seal or something. So yeah, we have these specimen stripers that are just, I mean, they're all fish of lifetimes, and you got to put your hours in to catch them. But I've been part of so many fish of lifetimes with clients, chasing striper specifically. But my boat record, I believe, is 49 pounds for a client. I
Oh
think
my god.
Hogan's boat records, I think, is 51. So there is definitely, like, if you just take the Sacramento River as a snapshot, it's just such an insane resource, man, that you have that many different types of fish all living technically in the same water, but they're all spread apart depending on the warm part of the Sacramento or cold part. But it's just a amazing resource, and it's so fun to guide. I mean, one thing in the Rockies is, as a guide, if you're just a trout guide, it can get really repetitive. Like, okay, we're going to go fish mayflies today, or stoneflies, or hoppers, or we're going to throw streamers. There's some variation in it, but when you're a guide in California, like, one day you're trout fishing, and then 2 days later you're fishing for steelhead, and then you're chasing stripers, or then you're chasing bass or shad. Like, there's so much variation in fish species in NorCal that, I mean, it's a fun place to guide.
Yeah, I felt like when I was living in California, I became a better angler and a worse trout fisherman. Because I was doing something different every single time, right? Whether it was stripers from the beach, um, I tried for a while to find leopard sharks, which was wild. And then I might hit the truckee, but I hadn't fished for trout for a while. And then, you fish the lower sack, which is very different than the truckee. And it's pretty diverse. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, it definitely makes you a better angler, because you're constantly picking up a different rod with a different technique, Yeah, I think you get to a point as an angler, once you become more advanced that, trout fishing kind of becomes pretty easy. I mean, the methods of catching trout are pretty, I don't know, they're straightforward. You can nymph for them. You can throw a streamer, you can throw a dry fly. I mean, I know some guys swing soft tackles, and there's different ways to approach it. But every river's in itself is unique. But once you kind of have a really strong base of how trout behavior works, you can pretty much go to most rivers and do well. But to really become an accomplished angler in my mind is you have to be a guy who can walk up to a trout river or steelhead river, kind of understand what's happening before you get there. But then, on your next trip, you're saltwater fishing off the beach and understanding how to read currents on a beach or how to read pockets on a beach, or, striper fishing or fishing to, fish blitzing bait out in the ocean. Like there's all these techniques, and every time you go out there, you're learning information, right? Like you're building your repertoire of techniques, and like to really become what I consider like a master angler, an accomplished angler, is someone who really knows how to, like, okay, I can go from the Truckee River or to the lower Sac, or I can go offshore in San Diego, and I kind of have the skill set where you can hand me a 12 weight or you can hand me a 3 weight. I know what to do with it.
Yeah. Oh, this is making me miss California.
Yeah, you
Maybe I
and me
should
both.
maybe I should go fishing today. It's like I live on the Yellowstone. I have nothing to be sad about, but California is pretty special with all of that. So when you were guiding, I think I just got a taste of it, and I've read your book. But where were you generally guiding, and for what species?
Yeah, so I was guiding in Northern California, and kind of like we've alluded to, there's a lot of options. So I primarily guided the Sacramento River, the Feather River, the Yuba River. I would spend winter times up chasing coastal steelhead on the eel, and the systems up there. So primarily I was guiding for trout and steelhead, for the fall through the spring. And then in springtime, once the weather warmed up, then I would start adding the other species. Did a lot of topwater bass fishing, and then pretty much guided stripers June through August every summer. And I would just do stripers on my jet boat on the Sacramento River for those 3 months.
On the Feather, were you in those upper sections for trout?
Wasn't fishing above the lake, so we were fishing the lower Feather, primarily just targeting steelhead. The Feather River has a great steelhead run. They have two distinct runs. They have one in the fall, which starts kind of late September and runs till Thanksgiving. And then they have a spring run that a lot of people actually don't know about. And that run starts early March and goes all the way till mid-May.
And there's great salmon fishing in there too, huh?
Yes. The Feather is famous for salmon. Because it's so famous for salmon, there's a lot of conventional anglers that fish there. So the part of the river that's open for salmon is a little south of the town of Orville. Um, it gets really busy with jet boats and bank anglers. It's not really the ideal place to go fly fish for salmon just because of all the pressure. When the salmon are in there, you're talking like hundreds of bank anglers. So it's not the most idyllic fly fishing spot. But with those salmon, when they start spawning in the shallows and dropping their eggs, just like, they do in Alaska, those steelhead start stacking up behind them, usually in early October. And, the fall, we have a famous time period up here in California called the egg bite. October and November are probably the two most popular months in the Northern California Valley. And when all the salmon in the Sacramento, Yuba, or Feather Rivers, American River for that fact too, when they start spawning whatever fish, whether they're trout or steelhead, they start stacking up behind those and feeding on those eggs, and they become really easy to catch. So the egg bite on the feather is really well known, and that's generally when the fly fishermen show up. And thankfully, it's also corresponds to the salmon season closes October 15th. So there's hundreds of anglers there in September all the way through early October, and then October 15th, they all disappear. And all's left is a bunch of spawning salmon with willing steelhead eating eggs behind them, and just the fly guys are there. So it becomes a little more peaceful, a little more doable. But it's a great fishery. I would probably spend about a third of my guide days every year fishing
Oh,
the Feather
cool.
River.
Yeah, I went to that lower section once solo and didn't know how to navigate all the other boats. Then I went up to the upper section, and it's gorgeous up there, but there are a lot of signs saying to beware of rattlesnakes. So,
Yes,
so that was
I actually
my
don't.
that was my
Yeah,
cue.
I don't have a lot of time fishing the upper rivers, to be honest. I've only spent a handful of days up there. A lot of my guiding, and I think this is true for a lot of guides, but people love fishing out of boats. So 100% of my guiding was all boat fishing,
Okay.
whether it was from my drift boat or from my jet sled for stripers.
If there were signs up there that said beware of bears, mountain lions, and sharks, I'd be fine with it. But as soon as the rattlesnake sign gets in the mix, I'm gone. So,
Yeah, yeah,
so
I like to
sorry.
see some river sharks.
Yeah, right. Actually, I'm originally from Washington D.C. and um, sharks lately have been working. Bull sharks have been working in their way into the Potomac.
That's
So,
crazy, man.
yeah. Um, but that's not happening up there. These experiences led to a new book that just came out this year, right?
Yeah, I launched the book in February. It's called A Real Job, REEL. Um, you can find it on Amazon. It's a collection of short stories. It's some of my best guide stories from 20 years of guiding. It's really interesting when you read fly fishing books. Most of the books are written from the perspective of an angler, right? They tell you about some experience, whether catching a fish or dealing with another angler, but very rarely is a book written from a guide's point of view. So as a guide, you're sitting in a boat in my situation, or some guys are walking and waiting, but for me, we're boat fishing, and the most interesting stories rarely deal with the fish that you catch. Everyone has a story of the big one they lost or the big one they caught or some funny thing that happened with the fish. But in my opinion, the most interesting and funny stories that would get traction with my clients as I told these stories over 20 years were always the stories about the people and about the interactions you would have with random clients. And you'd be surprised how free people become when they hire guides. And sometimes there's personality conflicts. Sometimes there's just people getting hammered drunk. Other times there's clothes being taken off. So there's a lot I've experienced. A lot of my friends, joke with me like, how did you come upon these people? I don't know how to answer that question, but I've had a lot of really unique experiences happen in the boat that are like laugh out loud, something you would see in a movie. And I was telling these stories to some clients one night, and my dad happened to be there joining us for dinner. And one of my clients asked me to rattle off like, hey, what's one of your best guide stories? And so I told him a funny story, and they were all laughing. And then that led into a second story, and then a third one. And next thing I know, I was literally just rattling off guide stories for like 2.5 hours, and people are making comments, and just like, we're all drinking wine around the table, and we're having a good time. And as the evening would progress, everyone would go to bed. And the next morning, my dad, was there, and he goes, man, last night was amazing. Like, he goes, do you realize you had the whole table entertained for several hours? Like, he goes, whether it's for our family or for your own sake or for your kids' sake, like, you need to write some of this stuff down so that way when you eventually do become an old man, you don't forget all this stuff. And so a couple years go by, and I'm working on Cast Hope. I end up finishing my work earlier than planned, and I kind of had 3 or 4 hours of free time, and so I just opened up my laptop and pulled up a Word document and just started typing. And I've been really blessed with this vivid memory, so like if something memorable happens in the boat, not the day-to-day stuff, but if something, a memorable fish or a memorable situation with a client, I can literally just close my eyes and I can feel it. It's like a movie playing in my head. Like I can tell you what the weather was like. I can tell you what was said. I can tell you what was happening and the emotions that were going between people. And so I just kind of started typing. And then, as a guide, when you're experiencing these extreme situations, you can't really give your true honest opinion, right? Like that's how people get angry. So I was able to relive these memories through writing, and then kind of add some like guide comments along the way, that I thought were funny. And so I wrote one, and then I was like, wow, man, that was fun. Like I really enjoyed it. I did it for myself. I wasn't doing it for anyone else. And the next week I had some more free time, so I did another one. And so I ended up writing like 22 chapters over about a year and a half period. And then my wife and I had our second child, and I had free time when we only had one kid. But when the second kid came along, all that free time kind of disappeared. So the book has been written for 7 or 8 years, and it's one of the fruit of COVID. When COVID hit and it got really weird and everybody was canceling guide trips and nothing was happening with Cast Hope. So what I did is I found myself with 2 months of free time. So I spent the whole month of April of 2020, and I went back and I rewrote the whole thing. I reread the whole thing, and then I would hire an editor to finally finish a 10-year project. So the book was published in February. It's been a total blast to hear all the positive reviews from everyone. And it's one thing to get positive feedback from your friends and your family, right? Like, I mean, you can't really trust it. But when you have people hitting you up from other countries saying, oh my gosh, that's the best book I've read this year, I hope you write another one, or someone from the East Coast who's giving you positive reviews, like, it is really humbling, Tim. And like, I never imagined it making any money. I literally did it for myself, and just because I enjoyed the process. And now we're to the point where I've sold like 1,000 copies. I can't really believe it. I mean, obviously it's not a New York bestseller, but for someone who just had a good time writing down and reliving those memories to getting all this positive feedback from people I've never met, like it's been a humbling, fun process. It's literally been the highlight of 2022 for me.
That's fantastic. And there, throughout these stories, you've also brought in a lot of reflection and things you've learned through. It's not just the client's journey on the water, but your own over the course of this career.
Yeah, that's kind of who I am as a person. A lot of my friends call me an old soul, and they've called me that for a long time. And I think one thing through fly fishing is, whether you're out there with your family or your friends, or in my case as a guide, a lot of just random people, like you learn things about humanity, you learn things about yourself, you learn how certain people handle certain situations. And I kind of share that through the book. Some people, you might not agree with them, but my hope through the book is to tell the story, to allow the reader to make their own opinion of what's happening. And then generally at the end of every chapter, I'll give you a couple paragraphs on like kind of what I thought about it. Yes, there'll be some funny remarks made as you read it through the chapter, but I really think that's important in life. When you go through these experiences, and some of these experiences in the book are really extreme. Some are funny, some are shocking. There are some stories in there that, I finished the book on a story of a great friend who passed away, and it's super emotional for me. And it's actually been really emotional for a lot of readers. And all these situations, when we go out with our other friends or family members, like there's all these time for reflection, and it usually doesn't happen right away. but it could be just that you're out on the water with your dad and you're spending time with a loved one, right? Like that's all it has to be. But when you do this as a profession for 20 years, you get to spend hundreds, which turns into thousands days of the water. And when you're just highlighting a handful of those stories, it's pretty easy to be reflective and really take not just a story and tell the story, but make it meaningful.
That's great. Speaking of meaningful, you've mentioned Cast Hope a few times, but for those who aren't familiar, what is Cast Hope? What's the history there? What sparked your interest in getting this started?
Yeah, so Cast Hope is a fly fishing nonprofit for underserved kids, and underserved is a really vague term. That can mean kids that come from a low income family. It could mean kids who are coming from a broken family, like a one parent home. It could be kids who have experienced a lot of abuse. We just want to take kids who don't have the opportunity to have fly fishing in their life, and we take fly fishing guides and we provide free fly fishing experience for these kids throughout California. And now we have a fourth region in North Carolina. The spark of it started, I was actually going to grad school. I went to Chico State for an MBA once I was done with Davis. And in grad school, my wife and I were attending a Presbyterian church in Chico, and our pastor talked about using your personal gifts to change your local community. So most time you go to church, you hear the pastor talk, it's all great, you leave, and whatever message he gave or spoke about that morning just goes in one ear and comes out the other. And that Sunday, I couldn't get it out of my head for weeks and weeks. Like this thought of like, what am I doing to change my community just came back. And so sitting there reflecting, and I was like, well, I'm a really good guide. I have all the resources I need. I have a boat, I have all the rods. And so I think once a month, I'm just going to donate my time. And I've always had a passion for youth. I volunteered for a lot of youth activities growing up. And so I was like, one trip a month, I'm going to volunteer a trip and give a free trip to a kid just having a hard time. And so the first trip was a kid whose parents had split up recently, right? The kid was experiencing this divorce situation, having a hard time. And so I took him and his buddy fishing for the day. That would turn into me taking a kid who's battling cancer. And over about 6 months period, just kind of doing word of mouth, I would end up meeting a kid who was in junior high, and his dad had passed away the year before. So his uncle was kind of stepping into that male role model. And I offered the uncle, like, hey, why don't you bring you and your nephew on a trip? It's completely on me. And so we were on the lower Sacramento River fishing for trout. And so I have this junior high kid standing in front of me, and his uncle's behind me. And the kid hooks and lands his second fish, so we have the second trout in the net, and the kid is just ecstatic. And then he looks back at his uncle and he goes, this is the coolest thing I have ever done. Like, and then he goes, I want to go buy a fly rod, and I want this to become the thing that the two of us do.
Oh.
And so I'm sitting in between the two of them. Some people call it a God moment. Some people call it a holy shit moment, whatever you want to call that. But I'm experiencing this kid with like 100% pure joy of like, oh my gosh, I found something. And I just sat in the boat and I was like, man, I got to figure out how to do this more than once a month. So all the steps were in place. Like I was in grad school, and part of grad school was you could create a program to start a business, right? So I met with a couple professors to start a fly fishing nonprofit for kids. And then my wife's boss at the time, his wife, so a couple people were moved. She was a nonprofit consultant, so Laura Kutsona, the consultant, would end up meeting with me for free 3 or 4 times. And then I had 2 professors breathing life into Cast Hope. And I just had this group of people kind of surround me and say, hey, like, we'll help you build the business model, but this model is going to work because fly fishing is an affluent sport. And if you're willing to dedicate your time and energy and serve kids in the way that you want to, then the fly fishing industry is going to support you because there's money in the clients, right? Your donor base is already there. So on a whim, I finished my MBA, and then a month after I finished my MBA, I applied for the nonprofit status. So I'm the founder of Cast Hope, and we currently have 4 regions. We have 3 regions in California. We have the North Valley, which is kind of Northern California. Then we have a second region we started 6 years ago in Truckee and Reno, Nevada. And then we started our region in San Diego a couple years ago. And just this summer, we started a region in North Carolina. So Cast Hope is growing. We're impacting more kids. Last year, we had 700 kids in our program.
Wow.
And we have about 30 guides who guide for Cast Hope and guide under our logo. And the whole idea of Cast Hope is that you have to catch the kid from the very first time they come out. And there's a lot of organizations who take kids fishing, but when they take them fly fishing, they start them like, oh, we're going to do a day of casting, and then they do a couple days of casting, and then they do a couple days of fly tying, and then 3 months later, they actually take the kid fishing. So the part of the business model was, when we created it, is the number one goal for us is retention. Like, if you really want to change a kid's life, you need that kid to come back, not because of the fishing, so that way you can mentor the child, right? And the more the kid that comes back, the more impact you can have on that kid's life. So the way we do things is we hire fly fishing guides. They are paid a reduced rate. Most of them are paid half of what they would normally make on a normal day. And the kids go out with a guide on their very first experience. And so that is the highest odds for that kid to come connected to a fish. If that kid comes to connected to a fish and experiences that life and that energy, the odds of that fish, the odds of that kid coming back and the retention stays really, really high. Our hope is that the retention of the kid is as highest as possible. So the whole goal is to get that kid to come back to the organization, so that way you have an opportunity to mentor that kid. You don't want to have a kid come out and say, oh, that's really cool, I enjoyed casting, and then you never see him again. So what we do is we put all the kids with guides. So their first experience, they're going on a guided trip. And then if they have a great time, then they're invited on another guided trip. And after 2 or 3 guided trips, once they kind of get the bug of like, oh my gosh, this is fun, I want to do this, then at that point, we do what we call our clinics. At our clinics, we take the kids and the mentors to a local spot within 30 to 60 minutes of where they live, and we teach them how to fish a local water where they don't need a boat. So at these clinics, we're going to give them free rods, free flies, and we're going to bring guides there, and then we're going to have the guides teach them how to fish that local spot. So a lot of these clinics in Northern California, we actually are teaching the kids how to bass fish. You know, bass are available to anybody and everybody, right? They're in creeks, they're in ponds, they're on golf courses, lakes. So it's a very accessible game fish. So we do a lot of popper fishing, a lot of streamer fishing, and we teach these kids how to fish for bass. And so the most rewarding thing for me is that when I get a picture sent to me from a kid and his mentor, they're out, bass fishing or fishing for bluegill, and they're sending me this picture where Cast Hope wasn't involved at all. Like, this kid has taken the tools that Cast Hope has given them, he's taking the knowledge the guide has taught them, and they've gone out and become independent fishermen without our organization. Now, that kid will continue to be invited to everything we do throughout the year, but it shows you that the kid is actively pursuing something that we're all passionate about, and we're handing fly fishing down to the next generation.
That's fantastic. And you've been doing this for so long that you've probably been able to stay connected with kids who are no longer kids anymore. And have you had any of those encounters? What is it like to be running into, I don't know if you say Cast Hope graduates or, people who are impacted by the program years and years ago?
Yeah, it's exactly what we call them. We call them Cast Hope graduates. We have been in existence for 13 years, which is mind-blowing to me. There's been a lot of time, sweat, and tears built into that. But yes, we have lots of graduates come through our program, and there's kind of one part of our program that I never imagined, and it's not really what Cast Hope was made to do. But every once in a while, we'll find these kids that are super passionate about fishing. Like, some kids are passionate about sports. Some kids are passionate about chasing girls, chasing boys. like every once in a while you find this kid who all they want to do is fish. And like that, they're the ones fly tying. They're the ones watching every YouTube video of every trip they can't afford, like, and those kids, we kind of do a special program for them. And a lot of those kids, we're actually taking them fishing monthly. And some of those kids, we actually have had 3 of them turn into guides. So we have a guide on the South Fork of the Snake River in the summertime, and then the rest of the year he's in Northern California. His name's Harrison King. And then we have another kid on the Madison River who's guiding for the Slide In. He is running the fly shop there in the off season, and then guiding all summer. And we have a third kid who's guiding in Alaska. So when you told me 13 years ago that you were going to create jobs for kids, I would have told you, no way. Like, that's so far beyond anything Castle can ever do. But the interesting part is these kids we've all become like personal friends with. And so these are kids that we now mentor as guides, right? At first, we were just trying to help them improve their life, give them an outlet to get away from their harsh realities, right? And they found fly fishing as a safe haven to do that. And as they grew up, turned into older teenagers, graduating high school, and they're like, wow, we want to do what you do, and then all of a sudden your role kind of switches from like, oh, I'm mentoring a kid, to now like I'm literally paving a employment road for this kid, and so now like they call us with guiding questions, right? It's like, hey, how do I handle this when this happens with a client? It's no longer about just you're taking me fishing. So yeah, the rest of my life I will sit there knowing that there's a handful of these really special cases of Cast Hope that were truly life-changing, and that I was there paving a path for the life I've lived for the last 20 years, and a lot of these Cast Hope graduates have been guiding for 3 years now. And it'll be mind blowing when I'm in my mid 50s and I'm calling them for a guide trip. Right.
Yeah.
And I'm going to, go fish the Madison, and I'm calling Hunter to be like, hey man, are you available this August? How humbling is it going to be when I have a Cast Hope kid on the sticks rowing me when I was the one that taught them everything when they were in high school?
That's cool.
So yes, it has come full circle.
And for those who want to see more about this, there's a film that came out about a year ago called Looking Upstream, the Cast Hope Story. That is on YouTube. Also, it's on the Venturing Angler if you search Looking Upstream. And I really recommend checking that out.
That is a super special video that was made by one of your buddies, Brian.
Yep.
And the story behind that, we've kind of alluded to it earlier in the podcast, but when I was 12, my first day of fly fishing was on the South Fork of the Snake River. I would end up guiding there 13 years later, which is a full circle in itself, right? So when I was 25, I would apply for a job. I would end up working for a lodge on the South Fork, and I would end up spending 5 summers guiding on the South Fork of the Snake. So I was going back to a river that literally I casted my first fly on. I would end up guiding. And then, Cast Hope starts in that time period. Cast Hope starts building. I no longer have the time to spend my summers in Idaho, so I have to commit to California full time. And then 10 years after I left guiding there, we would have a Cast Hope kid, Harrison, go back, and I would help Harrison get a job on the South Fork at the lodge I used to work for. And so Harrison is now a guide every summer on the South Fork of the Snake. So, I mean, you're literally talking a 25-year period of time. But when I was 12, I casted my first fly on the South Fork, and now I'm 40. And when I go to the South Fork, I call Harry to take me fishing on the same river I cast my first fly on.
That's great. That's so cool.
So that video we made with Brian, Looking Upstream, encompasses that whole story of that journey over 25 years.
Brian really loved working on that film. And actually, right before this podcast, he and I were texting a lot, and I didn't want it to jump into, I'm easily distracted. I didn't want all these texts to be popping up while we were talking. So I said, I'm about to go into a podcast with Ryan Johnston. And his response was, Cast Hope, sweetness.
It's really humbling, Tim. Um, I'm the founder, and I continue to steer the ship, but Castleup doesn't exist because of me. It exists because of so many people breathing life into it. Whether it's Brian helping us make a film to share the story with the employees that help run the organization, to our regional directors that take care of every region we have the organization in. And then it takes donors, it takes people to donate money to the cause, to participate in fundraising events. And there's a lot of money that gets donated to Cast Hope to be handed down to these kids, to take them on these experiences. And we're doing really good work, man, and we're changing lives. But to be the one who started it, to be the one who continues to run it, it's the most humbling thing I've done in my life.
That's fantastic. And people are inspired by it and they love it. I don't know, 2 weeks ago, someone emailed me the link to the video and said, you need to watch this, which was cool. And so, I think it's exciting, especially in a case like that, for people to see, with their own eyes, if you will, what you guys are up to. And it's great work.
Yeah, for anyone that's interested, check out the website, casthope.org. There's tons of information there. If you want to just watch some videos, if you want to donate to the cause, if you want to get involved, there's a lot of things happening with the organization as we're trying to grow. Our hope is that Cast Hope in the next 10 years can be in another 5 to 6 towns, and we can start growing more than just regionally, but we can start growing to a national level and serving kids across the country.
That's great. So casthope.org. And then on social media, where can folks find Cast Hope?
Yeah, Cast Hope's on Facebook. It's on Instagram. Those are pretty much our two main platforms. Should be pretty easy to find. You can follow us there for content of a bunch of kids catching fish to our current fundraising events. We host fishing events throughout the year. We host online auctions. So there's a lot of ways for donors across the country to get involved.
And then you mentioned your book is on Amazon. Is that the best place for folks to track that down?
Yep, Amazon, A Real Job, REEL. I promise you, you will laugh. And if you don't, I will give you your money back.
Cool. Perfect. Yeah. And also I like I mentioned, I had an opportunity to read the book and it's great. I recommend it. And it's, it can be a quick and easy read. It can be a great gift. And so head on over to Amazon and check that out. And of course, casthope.org. Ryan, thanks for coming on.
Thanks, Tim, man. It's so much fun to hang out with you, dude, and just chat fishing. And thank you for your support.
Let's go do some dry fly fishing soon in Montana.
Amen.
Sounds
Anytime
good.
you want to, brother.
Perfect. Take care.